Tonight you part the misty veil from time to time to ease the weariness of your soul, and you find yourself leaving behind the thick walls of the Middle Ages. Before the calendars have yet to point to the 1500s AD, you step into the period immediately following the longest night of the year. The end of December did not hiss with the excited lights of the future, but with the heavy atmosphere of darkness and religious anticipation. You now stand under the dim light of a trembling candle on a cold stone floor. The arrival of the new year was not an explosion of celebration but a complex whisper of thousand-year-old traditions. And you begin to witness the quiet preparations for the eve of the new year in this ancient world. A lord's kitchen, late 1300s. You are just outside the vast kitchen of a lord's manor towards the end of the 1300s. The winter solstice, a tradition rooted in pre-Christian times, was being prepared for here within these walls in the heaviest and slowest manner. The first step of a chain of feasts spanning the entire winter was taken on that gloomy day when daylight was shortest. Servants and cooks had begun preparations days in advance, not so much for the new year, but more for the sacred and seasonal beginning of winter. Heaviness was felt in everything. The butchering of cold carcasses of slaughtered cattle, the slow heating of massive ovens, and the sorting of spices. The intensity of these preparations was much calmer yet more burdensome than the bustle of an ordinary day. Chickens and geese were not prepared alive but in salted and preserved forms applied by butchers, sometimes kept directly in enriched brines. Considering the general conditions of the period, the maintenance of such a rich and abundant food supply by feudal power stands in sharp contrast to the people's fear of famine. Feast preparations were a kind of silent demonstration of the Lord's service and protection vow. Cooking the meals took hours, even days. Thick-walled stone ovens were lit from the early morning, their heat slowly permeating every corner. This long cooking was necessary not only to tenderize the meat but also to alleviate the hygiene issues of preservation and consumption in that era. The heaviness and abundance of the meals ensured not only their longevity but were also seen as a symbol of the nobility's trade status with distant lands. If you were an ordinary peasant of that time, you would watch these grandiose preparations of the winter solstice feasts only from afar with a mixture of hunger and curiosity. While the head cook stirred the massive copper pots, the steam rose from the kitchen chimney as a heavy, thick smoke into the sky. The scent of this smoke, compared to the simple smell of bread in your cold and damp hut, was like a dream of paradise. Remember, in those years, eating meat was not a weekly or monthly routine but a rare privilege. These feasts represented a wealth of food that the vast majority of the people could never normally access. The slowest part of the preparations was the hours-long stirring process of the heavy, sweet puddings made from fruits and grains. This was a monotonous, endless task done by brute force. At every stage, the texture and temperature of the ingredients had to be constantly checked. These dishes, bearing the Lord's prestige, were sometimes adorned with gold leaf or silver threads, presented not just as a food source but also as a work of art. This slowness and heaviness was a reflection of the medieval sense of time. Everything lasted much deeper and longer compared to today's speed. Preparation was not just about cooking but also about preserving status and order. And as you inhaled the intense, overpowering smell coming from that kitchen, you felt the sharpness of the period's class division in your bones. A peasant's hut. You are now in a simple, dirt-floored house of a medieval peasant. New Year's Eve, in contrast to the Lord's feast preparations, was a period of scarcity management for you. Life depended on how carefully the harvest gathered in autumn was rationed. The depth of the grain store was the only real determinant of whether you would survive the cold, long days of January. Every handful of bread flour was a fortune that would provide energy for the next day. The strategy of this period was to consume as little as possible and make it last as long as possible. Salted and dried vegetables, usually cabbage or root vegetables, formed the basic food source throughout the winter. Preparing these vegetables was a process that took hours and was monotonous. They were thinly sliced, preserved with intense layers of salt, and stored in a cold, dim cellar. Hunger was not just a feeling but a way of life. Sometimes, in the middle of winter, eating something fresh was nearly impossible. Although ale and wine were safer drinks due to the lack of hygienic water, their consumption was carefully limited even before the new year. Every sip was a testament to the labor spent and the land worked in autumn. Considering the general conditions of the period, the peasantry living under this constant threat of famine shows that the majority of society was in a constant struggle for survival. In that era, instead of dreaming of a great feast, you would silently calculate how to make your meager food last longer. The hunger in your children's eyes was a trial you faced every day. Sometimes, edible herbs gathered from the forest or brambleberries were the only variety added to the menu during this difficult period. Finding these required hours of walking in the cold, which meant depleting your already limited energy. For the peasant, entering the new year was a quiet relief of having survived the dangers of death and disease for another winter. This heavy and long period was a simple ritual of survival. A noble hall. You are now in a dim corner of a great hall of a noble family, where even the winter sun struggles to reach. As the new year approaches, the atmosphere here carries more of a legal and inheritance solemnity than celebration. The tradition of rereading wills and land agreements was one of the heaviest and most formal rituals of the nobility. This act was not only a legal necessity but also a long, tedious ceremony that reinforced the hierarchy within the family and the inviolability of the feudal order. A knight or lord would read the thick parchment documents in a heavy, monotonous tone by candlelight. Every word represented the division of land, the transfer of titles, and the family's control over future generations. Other family members had to remain silent and motionless during this long, monotonous reading. Sometimes, the reading could last for hours, wearying minds with the repetition of old legal terms and Latin phrases. Under the general conditions of the period, this ceremony showed the constant anxiety of the noble class over land and power, and their effort to keep this anxiety within a legal framework. As you listened to this reading, you understood that noble life was not as glorious as it appeared from the outside but was actually a heavy structure full of rules and obligations. The deep breath everyone took at the end of each paragraph was a reflection of this solemnity and tension. For the younger family members, this was a boring and incomprehensible torture. However, the rule of silence did not permit even the slightest movement. After the documents were read, they were sealed and stored securely against the unknowns the new year would bring. This act was a cold, legal New Year's beginning in a society where traditions and rules were held far above individual desires. Inside a medieval church. You are now within the high, damp walls of a medieval church. New Year's Eve here meant not joy but deep religious reverence. Churches began long, monotonous rosary prayers. These rites were not just a chain of prayers but also a heavy reflection of the people's effort to cleanse themselves of sin at the year's end. The rosaries were filled with the same prayers repeated hundreds of times. The meaning of these words, read in Latin, remained inaccessible and abstract for most peasants. But what mattered was not the meaning of the words, but the rhythm itself. Priests would read these prayers for hours in a low, trembling voice, with slow, halting breaths. The people had to kneel on the cold stone floor, sometimes without getting up for hours. This prolonged physical hardship was seen as a price for spiritual cleansing. The monotony of the rites was an intentional technique to slowly guide the mind towards sleep and deep contemplation. Considering the general conditions of the period, given the short and harsh existence of people's lives, the Church used these long rites to focus them on eternal salvation after death. As you sat between those cold stone walls, you heard the sound of the repeating prayers merging with the howl of the winter wind outside. These sounds slowly and steadily weighed down your consciousness. Through these rites, the new year was perceived not as a beginning but as a time of reckoning. These monotonous prayers were a heavy display of how serious and dominant religious life was for medieval people. Calendar confusion. In the medieval period you find yourself in, the calendar was not precise and reliable as you know it today. Even the exact start of the new year was an ambiguous issue that varied by region and even by church. Some places considered Christmas the beginning, while others took the Annunciation Day in March as the basis. This calendrical confusion created a silent, deep psychological burden on the people. The flow of time was not a fixed line but a slippery and unreliable concept. Uncertainty made everything mysterious and frightening. Not knowing the precise beginning of the new year created constant anxiety about when bad luck or supernatural disasters might come. Harvest times, tax payments, and religious holidays were all in a confusing irregularity due to these calendrical differences. In this period, the limitation of scientific knowledge and the dominance of religious beliefs caused people to accept this uncertainty with a more fatalistic approach. You feel that the new year is not just a date but also a sacred threshold determining the cycle of life and death. Considering the general conditions of the period, this uncertainty of the calendar was an extra layer of insecurity added on to the people's short lives and difficult existence. This chaos created a heavy ground that fed the medieval person's fear of the outside world and deep respect for the unknown. The weight of this chronological confusion was like a mist settling slowly and calmly in your mind. Ancient rituals. You are now in the midst of an ancient ritual, sacred and not yet fully integrated with religious teachings, on a deep, dark night of the medieval winter. The threshold of the new year meant not just a calendrical transition but also a moment when the veil with the world of the dead and evil spirits grew thin. These primitive beliefs had seeped into the deepest layers of peasant daily life despite the church's power. The effort to ward off old spirits was carried out not with loud religious prayers but with silent, physical actions with regional and cultural roots. The use of fire was at the center of these rituals. Huge bonfires with large, heavy logs slowly burning were lit in the village center. The flickering dance of the flames scattered the frightening darkness of the night a little. These fires were not just a heat source but also a symbol of purification and protection. You now stand by this fire with other peasants, their faces blackened by smoke, standing silently. Sometimes, heavy-smelling bundles made from dried winter plants were thrown into this fire. The thick, suffocating smoke produced was made to envelop the house from all sides. The belief was that this sharp smell would drive away unwanted and uninvited spirits. Another common ritual was to create noise. On the silent, heavy winter nights, with the arrival of the new year, pots and pans were banged together, and wooden spoons were rhythmically beaten on drums. These sudden, monotonous sounds created long, sharp echoes in the village's dim atmosphere. The purpose of these loud noises was to startle malevolent entities and force them to hastily flee from their safe havens in dark corners. Even children participated in this noise ritual, their high, thin voices accompanying the adults' heavy, low sounds. This was not a traditional religious ceremony but a primitive defense mechanism for survival. Considering the general conditions of the period, in this Middle Ages where epidemic diseases and famine roamed, evil spirits were not just an abstract threat for the people but also the supernatural source of visible and felt physical disasters. Therefore, alongside the long, complex prayers offered by the Church, they tried to prevent disaster with their own simple and practical methods. Branches of thorny plants believed to be sacred were hung on the thresholds of houses. These thorny barriers were meant to physically prevent spirits from entering the house. Doors and windows were meticulously closed on New Year's Eve, fearing that even the smallest gap would give passage to spirits. Water was another purification tool. Despite the winter cold, in some regions, entering icy river waters gently in the first hours of the new year was a heavy act done to purify body and soul. The shock of the water was not just a physical stimulus but also carried the belief of dispelling the weariness of the soul. You now see the people standing by the river, their faces serious and eyes dull. Their cold and dangerous act shows how strong the desire to survive is. These silent and arduous rituals were a heavy, monotonous reflection of the fragile relationship medieval people had with the outside world and their deep fear of the unknown. In an era when scientific knowledge was still advancing slowly, these primitive behaviors served as a kind of spiritual insurance for protection. Every movement carried an intention. It was performed silently and heavily, without a vow. Feudal obligations. You are now in the cold courtyard just outside a feudal manor, beginning to feel the weight upon you with the arrival of the new year. The New Year period was not a celebration for peasant tenants, but a time of reckoning when special and extra tax and corvée obligations, recorded in the Lord's Manor Book, were demanded silently and heavily. This was the Lord's means of covering winter expenses and reinforcing his status. The special tax was usually demanded in the form of goods or services rather than money. This heavy obligation upon you meant giving one of the most valuable things you had labored for all year. The thickest piece of salted meat, the best part of the dried beans, or a portion of the wood you needed to burn all winter were taken heavily by the Lord's overseers. This taking process occurred calmly. Under the dull, indifferent gazes of the overseers, weary peasants silently handed over what they had. Considering the general conditions of the period, this obligation was a pitiful reflection of the feudal system. The peasant class's constant obligation to lose their production surplus deeply affected their struggle for survival. Corvée obligations were the forced taking of bodily labor. Extra manpower was needed for the Lord's feast preparations before the new year. You are now tasked with carrying the new harvest from the Lord's granary in heavy, large sacks in the cold air. This hours-long monotonous work further depleted your already limited winter energy. Sometimes you had to work repairing the thick walls or stone roads in the Lord's castle. This forced labor was seen merely as a requirement of the tenancy agreement, without any payment. The weight of these extra obligations caused the peasantry to enter the new year with deep anxiety instead of hope. Everyone silently wondered what more the Lord would demand that year. Failure to fulfill taxes and corvée on time, or to the desired quality, could lead to heavy penalties. This meant the complete collapse of an already fragile family economy. This oversight and control mechanism shows the continuous and oppressive nature of the feudal system. Sometimes, lords would distribute a small, showy gift before the new year. This was usually bones or less valuable food left over from their feasts. This small favor was presented as a great act of kindness, but it was a drop in the bucket compared to what was taken. As you wait in this cold courtyard, you calmly compare the abundance behind the Lord's thick, secure walls with the scarcity inside your own hut. These forced services broke the theme of spiritual renewal brought by the new year, replacing it with the concrete, heavy reality of class inequality. In these winter days, peasants had to struggle with both the hardships of nature and the heavy obligations imposed by man. Every step, every breath was an act of sacrifice and submission. In the Lord's eyes, the new year meant the consolidation of his wealth, while for you it meant the silent payment of the cost of surviving another winter. This silent submission was a weary routine showing the deep, stagnant structure of medieval society. The hearth fire. You are now before the fire burning in the center of a simple, damp medieval home on the coldest days. This fire was not just a heat source but also the embodied spirit of life and home. In the middle of winter, especially around the new year, not letting this sacred fire go out was a deep and serious belief. The fire going out was seen as a sign of great disaster, disease, or the family facing famine. This was a traditional anxiety woven around the fire for thousands of years. This constant burning necessity made wood storage the most important and challenging task before the new year. You are now carrying heavy, hard winter logs to your hut with your broken hands. This exhausting action was a recurring, endless corvée that had been ongoing since autumn. The logs were stacked in a special arrangement not only to protect them from moisture but also to prevent evil spirits from touching them. The size of the woodpile was a silent indicator of the family's safety throughout the winter. To keep the fire alive, a silent, heavy shift system was established among family members. Even in the deepest, coldest hours of the night, someone had to sacrifice their sleep and slowly add a new log to the embering red fire. These night watches were a monotonous, constant struggle against sleep. As you gaze at the flickering shadows of the fire in that dim light, you feel the weight of this duty. Sleep was not a luxury but a danger against this important responsibility. Considering the general conditions of the period, since medieval homes had almost no heat insulation, a constantly burning fire was not just a spiritual protection, but also an absolute physical necessity to avoid freezing to death. Heat was the home's basic life source. At the same time, this constant burning, with the accumulation of smoke and smell, heavily affected the air quality inside the house. Your eyes would burn, your breathing would become difficult. But the need for the fire's warmth overrode these discomforts. The fire was also the only means of cooking. Therefore, the small amount of food prepared for New Year's feasts was cooked over this constantly burning sacred fire. The slow, heavy cooking of the food was an indicator of the fire's power and the home's abundance. What needed to be protected was not just wood. Sometimes fire was transferred among neighbors. If a house's fire accidentally went out, an ember was taken from another house to gently light a new fire. This act was a silent sign of community solidarity. But the shame and fear of the family whose fire went out was deep. You now listen to the soft crackling of the fire. This monotonous sound was a silent response to the long, frightening silence of the winter night. The slow charring of the logs showed that time was passing heavily, and the arrival of the new year was filled with anticipation. The weight of this simple, arduous routine was a reflection of how dependent medieval people were on nature's mercy, and the deep anxiety this dependence created. The red color of the fire represented the heart of the home. It silently announced that you and your family were alive. The monastery scriptorium. You are now in the icy cold and silent hall called the scriptorium of a medieval monastery. While the outside world busied itself with primitive rituals for the New Year's arrival, for the monks here, this night was a time of reckoning when order and knowledge were preserved in a heavy and meticulous manner. On New Year's Eve, the routine of the single inventory and record-keeping of the monastery's most valuable assets, the manuscript books, began. This was an action of hours-long, slow, uninterrupted silence. Monks stood before the library shelves with specially prepared heavy inventory books in the flickering light of candles. Each large, voluminous codex was gently taken from its place. Dust was cleaned with a soft brush, and the cold, hard texture of the parchments was carefully felt. The inventory process was not a rush but like a worship. Respect and solemnity were the only feelings in the air. Each book was not just an object but a sacred trust of recorded knowledge. The inventory of the books also involved examining their physical condition. Even the smallest details, like the fading of ink, the wear of pages, or the loosening of bindings, were recorded monotonously in a separate ledger. This attention to detail meant that in case of loss or damage, the responsible party would be silently identified. Talking during the inventory was strictly forbidden. Communication was provided slowly through hand gestures and written notes. Considering the general conditions of the period, in this Middle Ages where the printing press was slowly spreading, monasteries were the only and fragile depositories of knowledge. This meticulous inventory routine was a heavy reflection of the effort to transmit knowledge without interruption. The loss of a book meant the disappearance of hundreds of years of labor and irreplaceable knowledge. As the inventory takes place in this cold hall, you inhale the heavy smell of old parchments, mold, and burned candle wicks spreading around. The most difficult part of the record-keeping routine was the reclassification of each book by source and content. Monks carefully read the long, complex Latin titles, checking the beginning and ending sentences. This mental effort, combined with the physical cold, caused the weariness to deepen. When the first lights of the new year began to filter through the narrow windows of the scriptorium, the inventory might not yet be finished. But even in these weary moments, there was a peaceful solemnity on the monks' faces. They had silently fulfilled their duty of preserving order and wisdom even in the fear-filled darkness of the outside world. This monotonous inventory was a heavy and respectable New Year's routine showing how valuable and difficult to preserve knowledge was in the Middle Ages. Every number represented not just a record but a silent vow for the transmission of the past to the future. The butchering shed. You are now standing in the cold, dark slaughterhouse of a feudal manor. Meat provisioning for year-end feasts was one of the heaviest, bloodiest, and most organized routines of the Middle Ages. Cattle and pig slaughters were not just a physical job but a serious ceremony following specially defined heavy procedures for effective preservation and distribution. These procedures had to ensure the meat remained unspoiled throughout the winter. While the slaughter of the animal required speed, the subsequent processes were incredibly slow and detailed. Butchers separated the large pieces of meat one by one with their coarse, cold hands. Each cut served a specific purpose. Some parts would be salted for long preservation, others would be used fresh at the Lord's New Year's banquet. You deeply inhaled this heavy smell of slaughter, the intense combination of fresh blood, cold air, and salt. The pig slaughter, in particular, required intense attention. Not a single part of its fat or offal was allowed to go to waste. Fat was used in making candles and soap, while offal was used in making simple, long-lasting foods like sausages. This waste-free approach shows the economic mentality of the Middle Ages shaped by the fear of famine. Salting the meat was the most critical and slowest stage. Large, deep wooden barrels were carefully cleaned. Expensive, heavy layers of salt were meticulously sprinkled between the meat pieces. This process could take hours. It was necessary to ensure each piece was completely covered with salt. Insufficiently salted meat meant the spoilage of an entire winter's stock, a great disaster for the family or manor. Considering the general conditions of the period, this high level of meat consumption showed not only the power of the noble class but also the strategic importance of using cold air as a natural preservation method. The special heat and smoke adjustments used for drying and smoking the meat required heavy, monotonous supervision for days after the slaughter. As you breathe in the heavy, dense smoke inside the smokehouse, You silently watch the meat slowly change its color and texture. The fresh meat set aside for the New Year's feast was kept in a special ice cellar or underground cold storage. This separation was a concrete indicator of status and class difference. While the Lord and his guests tasted the tenderness of fresh meat, the majority of the people had to consume hard, overly salty winter meats. These heavy, complex procedures show how challenging and serious a task medieval logistics and food security was. Every step was taken carefully because there was no margin for error. Clothing restrictions, 12th century. You are now stepping into a cold, silent New Year's week of the 12th century AD. In this period, clothing was not just a means of protection but also a social and religious status indicator. And the days around the New Year were a period of silence when serious restrictions on clothing were applied. Wearing everyday, ordinary and labor-soiled garments was strictly forbidden throughout this sacred week. This ban imposed a heavy obligation, especially on the peasant and artisan classes. You had to set aside the coarse wool or linen clothes you wore in the field or workshop for the rest of the year. In their place, you had to slowly put on your clean, less worn holiday clothes, which were rarely used. These clothes were usually of paler colors, less practical, and offered less protection against the cold. This mandatory change was the result of a religious belief that outward appearance must reflect inner reverence. Avoiding the ban gave the people a silent fear. The dirt and dust of everyday clothes were interpreted as sin and worldly impurity carried into the new year. Therefore, even the poorest peasant had to change at least his outer layer to a clean, non-forbidden fabric. This obligation meant an extra trial for families already in difficult economic situations. Making or procuring special clothes for the new year with already limited resources was a heavy sacrifice. Considering the general conditions of the period, in the Middle Ages, clothes were produced slowly and used for years. This mandatory cleaning and change was a routine that shortened the lifespan of garments but was seen as absolutely necessary by religious authorities. During this special week, when you were in church or in the community with your cleanest clothes, you felt uncomfortable and tense. Because the condition of your clothes was an indicator of your religious respectability. The slightest tear or stain could cause serious criticism or social stigma. This ban could cover not only the type of clothing but also its color. In some regional traditions, very bright or very dark colors were seen as contrary to the week of mourning and reverence. Therefore, natural and pale colors were preferred. Although working during the New Year week was silently banned, the prohibition of everyday clothes was like a measure to prevent this forbidden work from becoming physically visible. Your clean, calm clothing sent a message to the outside world. I respect this sacred period and have withdrawn from worldly affairs. This heavy, simple clothing routine reflected the medieval person's obligation to show religious conformity through outward appearance and behavior. The absence of everyday clothing was a silent, heavy symbol of a period of purification and waiting. You now walk towards the new year with heavy steps in these rigid, yoke-like clothes. This silent rule was a slow reminder of how seriously and controlled medieval social and religious life handled every detail. Horseshoes and red ribbons. You are now approaching the simple, coarse wooden doors of medieval village homes. The arrival of the new year, along with the solemnity of religious rites, revived the ancient and simple superstitions people used to ward off bad luck. Among these primitive protection methods, the use of horseshoes and red ribbons was one of the most common and silently applied. The horseshoe, especially since it was shaped by the blacksmith's forge's strong fire, was believed to carry great spiritual power. You now see an old, rusty horseshoe gently nailed above the home's main entrance door. It was critical that the horseshoe's open end faced upwards, in a U shape. This represented the belief that good luck would gather like a bowl and be kept in the house. A horseshoe turned downwards could cause luck to flow out. This heavy, metal object nailed to the door served as a protective shield for the family. The belief was that evil spirits and demons feared metal, and the horseshoe's circular form would create an impassable barrier around the house. This simple ritual was a source of consolation against the constant anxiety in medieval people's daily lives. The red ribbon was another silent protection symbol. Red was accepted as a vibrant color that broke the power of the evil eye and diseases in that period. You see a small, thin red ribbon gently tied to the sides of cradles, around animals' necks, or on the barn door. These fabric pieces were usually made from the cheapest material, but their spiritual value was very high. The presence of this light, colorful object was believed to silently protect the family from illness and misfortune the new year might bring. Considering the general conditions of the period, the prevalence of epidemic diseases and high mortality rates during childbirth caused people to feel helpless against uncontrollable disasters. Simple rituals like these horseshoes and ribbons gave them a slight sense of control, as if they could influence their fate with a small touch. Although the Church's official teachings did not accept such superstitions, the people continued to practice these ancient methods secretly and with heavy respect. As you slowly walk around the house, you notice the number of these silent precautions taken against invisible dangers. Sometimes a red thread was gently wound around a child's wrist. Sometimes an old piece of metal was heavily buried in a corner of the vegetable garden. These rituals reflected the deep belief of medieval people that they lived intertwined with supernatural powers. Every object whispered a promise of protection, hoping the family would remain silently safe in the heavy, long days of the new year. These simple but vital uses were a point where fear and hope silently met. The village blacksmith. You are now in the dim, smoke-filled workshop of the village blacksmith, days before the new year. The winter cold outside creates a sharp contrast with the intense heat of the sharp, red fire in the forge. Blacksmiths held vital importance in medieval society, and the weeks before the new year were their busiest and most exhausting work period. Everyone brought their worn and broken tools used in the field or at home to be repaired before the long winter days began. Working conditions were heavy and uninterrupted. The blacksmith had to bring down the heavy hammer in a monotonous rhythm from morning till night. The sound of metal on the anvil created long, weary echoes in the village's silent winter air. You see the blacksmith's muscles in their repetitive, exhausted movements. Every hammer blow was a sound of labor and necessity. The cramming of tool repairs just before the new year stemmed from the necessity of having tools ready during this stagnant period of winter when the land was not worked and there was idle time. The repair list was long, and each job required meticulous attention. Reforging broken plowshares, sharpening worn axe blades, repairing door hinges. These repetitive jobs slowly led the blacksmith's mind to weariness. As the blacksmith breathed under high heat and dense smoke, sweat and soot covered his body in a heavy layer. Considering the general conditions of the period, for the peasant, the condition of tools represented the thin line between survival and starvation. A damaged plow meant lower yield in the next planting season. Therefore, the blacksmith's labor before the new year was a vital investment for the entire village's future. Peasants waited silently for hours in the cold outside the workshop for their turn. This wait was a sign of silent respect for the blacksmith's intensity. Sometimes the blacksmith also had to make special knives or metal ornaments for the feasts. But priority was always on practical tools for survival. This double duty further weighed down the burden on the blacksmith's shoulders. The forge fire did not go out even in the deepest hours of the night because the metal had to be constantly hammered before it hardened. In the dim light of those red embers, you see the weary but determined expression on the blacksmith's face. This intense work was a heavy, monotonous display showing the uninterrupted and limitless nature of medieval labor. The cathedral bells. You are now near a high cathedral on a silent, dark New Year's night in a medieval town. As midnight approaches, the sky and streets begin to be enveloped by a heavy, uninterrupted sound. The droning, repetitive sound of cathedral bells. These bells not only announced the hour but also declared a religious transformation of time. The bell-ringing routine was a heavy, monotonous sound festival lasting hours. It began with a slow, deep strike. There would be a long, silent wait between each strike. This rhythm gradually accelerated, turning into a repetitive, dominant noise that kept the medieval mind awake against sleep. Each bell had a different tone and size, which together created a complex, droning acoustic weight when combined. These choppy, repeating sounds emphasized the religious importance the new year would bring. The bell ringing was a spiritual duty to drive away evil spirits and invoke God's grace upon the new year. From a distance, you feel the physical vibration of the heavy, hard clappers striking the metal surface. This noise broke even the silence inside homes, silently announcing the religious authority of the new year to everyone. Considering the general conditions of the period, in the Middle Ages, sound and noise were the only way to inform the people of time and events. The bells were a concrete indicator of the church's power and order. Although this hours-long sound routine disrupted people's sleep patterns, it was met with unchallengeable acceptance. Sleep was less important than religious duty. When the new year arrived exactly at midnight, the sound of the bells reached its peak, beginning to ring at the fastest and most violent rhythm. This exuberant but still monotonous noise marked the official end of the old year and the heavy beginning of a new religious cycle. Under this intense sound, you silently understand how precisely and grandly the flow of time was controlled by the Church. The droning of the sounds lingered in your ears for a long time, leaving a repeating imprint constantly reminding you of the heavy start of the new year. This bell routine was a slow, dominant experience showing that every moment of medieval life was framed within a religious context. Table manners in a noble hall. You are now at the edge of a long banquet table in a great, cold hall of a noble lord on New Year's Eve. While the common people outside are busy with sacred rituals, for the nobility, New Year's night is not just a celebration but also a tedious, slow hours-long training and display of table manners. This routine was a necessity designed to reinforce the distinction and superiority of nobility. Young nobles and guests were under uninterrupted surveillance throughout the long meal. Every movement, every bite, and every tone of speech had to conform to the strict, unwritten rules of etiquette. Under the Lord's supervision, you slowly eat the heavy, large foods. Hurrying or making unnecessary noise was immediately condemned behavior. The obligation to eat silently and calmly was more an indicator of submission to authority than enjoyment of the meal. Training progressed with the silent correction of individual errors. Topics to be discussed during the meal were determined with solemnity and heavy protocol. Unnecessary joking or loud laughter was unbecoming of noble seriousness. In this heavy atmosphere lasting for hours, you constantly expend mental effort to keep your shoulders straight and avoid boredom. Although the meals were splendid, enjoying them was nearly impossible due to the strict rules. Considering the general conditions of the period, the noble class had to distinguish itself from the peasantry not only by wealth and land but also by behavior and refinement. This long table manners training meant the continuous, heavy reinforcement of social distinction. How the fork and knife were held, the sitting posture at the table, even the angle at which the wine glass was raised were all important. These details showed that noble life was built not on superficial events but on a hard and restrictive structure. One of the most tedious moments of the New Year's feast was the presentation of a large dish with a long, unnecessary explanation. The head cook or steward would slowly and monotonously describe the origin of each ingredient and the complexity of its preparation. Instead of tasting the food, you had to endure this long, unnecessary information. This was a continuous, heavy flaunting of the Lord's wealth and culture. This table manners routine was a slow, wearying New Year experience that displayed both the internal tediousness and external showiness of medieval nobility. Salt and spice samples. You are now standing on a cold but busy artisan street in a medieval town. As the new year approaches, for craftsmen and merchants, this period is not only a time of profit but also a time to silently reinforce their relationships with customers and suppliers. As a heavy, simple indicator of these relationships, small samples of salt and spices were offered as New Year's gifts. These gifts were not abundant and eye-catching like today's showy presents. On the contrary, they were small portions of practical, necessary, and very valuable materials. Salt, especially in inland areas, held vital importance for survival. It was indispensable for preserving food and adding some flavor to tasteless winter meals. A merchant would carefully wrap a handful of white, dry salt in linen or a thin piece of leather and gently place it in his valuable customer's palm. This small salt gift was a silent vow of loyalty and commercial trust. Spices were even more valuable. Fragrant and rare products like black pepper, cinnamon, or cloves coming from distant lands were luxuries only the rich could access. The very small amount of spice sample offered by a merchant increased the buyer's prestige and offered the possibility of adding extraordinary flavor to their simple meals throughout the winter. These valuable gifts could be a few carefully selected clove buds or a pinch of earth-colored ground black pepper. As you inhale the intense, lasting scent of these spices, you feel the economic weight of this small gift. Considering the general conditions of the period, in this Middle Ages where currency was unstable and barter was common, these small gestures made with materials of real value like salt and spices concretely strengthened relationships. This silent gifting ritual was part of the merchants' effort to ensure their business would be prosperous at the start of the new year. The customer would remember the merchant's generosity and prefer that shop again in their next purchase. The presentation of the gifts was also heavy and formal. On New Year's Eve, the merchant would wait in the dimmest corner of the shop by candlelight, and when his customer entered, he would bow and slowly extend his gift. The pace of commerce slowed on this special night, giving way to social courtesy. The small salt or spice sample in your hand carried the invisible weight of trust between you and the merchant. Sometimes artisans like blacksmiths or tanners would offer small samples of their own products instead of salt and spices, a carefully forged small iron key or a piece of red leather. But salt and spices, being universally desired and valuable, were the most common and most expected gifts. These small, practical gifts were a slow, silent indicator of the medieval merchant class's effort to preserve commercial order and goodwill as they entered the new year. Every grain of salt or spice whispered the economic hope for the next year. Distribution of leftovers. You are now in a cold, dark corner at the back door of the Lord's Manor, immediately after the New Year's feast. The abundance and splendor inside now had to face the need and scarcity outside. The distribution of leftover food to the poor was seen as an act of charity, but heavy, reticent rules were applied during this distribution. These rules were established to ensure that charity was orderly, controlled, and displayed the noble's generosity in an appropriate manner. Leftovers were never distributed randomly or with enthusiasm. First, they were collected by the Lord's servants in large, heavy cauldrons, sorted, and the most valuable parts were separated for the Lord's own use. The remaining bones, bread crumbs, and vegetable scraps were then mixed together for distribution to the people. The distribution process occurred with heavy, slow protocol. The poor formed a long, silent queue at the manor's back door. Making noise or breaking the line was strictly forbidden. The Lord's overseer maintained silence and order with a long stick in hand. As you wait in that cold air, you see the dull, hopeful expressions on the faces in front and behind you. Considering the general conditions of the period, these leftovers could provide a few more days of survival for a poor family. Therefore, obeying the rules was of vital importance. The amount of food distributed was aimed more at showing that the Lord had fulfilled his religious duty than at feeding the hungry. The reticent rules imposed humility and silently reinforced the people's dependence. Sometimes the distributed leftovers were in the form of a bowl of heavy, thick gruel. This simple mixture was a combination of leftover gravy and crumbs. This food carried more the purpose of sustenance than flavor. After this cold, tedious wait, when you finally received this heavy food placed in your wooden bowl, you had to silently show gratitude. The Lord's servants avoided eye contact with the poor during distribution, showing that class distinction was physically maintained. This routine silently enforced the shame and obligation of accepting poverty, while emphasizing the nobility's moral superiority. The distribution of leftovers was a cold, controlled, heavy display of medieval charity. It was more about the quiet payment of the social debt of the feudal order than mercy. The shadow of plague, 1400s. You are now looking at a heavy, gloomy New Year's period in the 1400s AD. This century was under the frightening shadow of the Black Death and recurring epidemics. These diseases completely changed New Year celebrations, filling the atmosphere with deep fear and unease. The cold shadow of epidemics heavily reduced the number and enthusiasm of mass celebrations. Large feasts and public festivals were silently cancelled or limited to small, closed family circles due to the risk of disease spread. This meant a period traditionally bringing the community together was spent in forced isolation. On New Year's night you see the squares empty and silent. Places that should normally be festive now gave a frightening sense of abandonment. Even religious rites were subject to serious restrictions. Churches were not as crowded as before. People avoided close contact out of fear of disease, participating in the rites with heavy, cautious silence. Nuns and monks began special prayers for the sick, which pushed the hopeful theme of the new year into the background, replacing it with anxiety for repentance and salvation. Considering the general conditions of the period, epidemics had seriously shortened the medieval person's lifespan. This constant threat of death turned every New Year's beginning into a moment of deep spiritual reckoning. Celebration was overshadowed by a silent anxiety about whether one would still be alive the next year. People might prefer fasting and praying to merrymaking and rich meals. The economic impact of epidemics also weighed down celebrations. The disruption of trade caused shortages and rising prices. The few foods on your table were harder to find and more expensive than in previous years. This economic heaviness caused practical worries to replace New Year's joy. Epidemics had also silently broken family structures. Empty places at New Year's tables heavily reminded of those lost, bringing sorrow instead of joy. During celebration, loud talking or singing was avoided because there was a simple but deep fear that the vibration of sound would spread the disease. This heavy, fear-filled atmosphere was the most distinct feature of the new year in the 1400s. Every breath carried a risk, every moment passed with the anxiety that it could be the last. This cold shadow was a deep reflection of the fragility and fatalistic acceptance in medieval life. The candle market. You are now in the marketplace of a medieval town on New Year's Eve. In this winter period with short daylight and long, dark nights, lighting materials were of vital importance. Candles and lamp oils were the most sought after and price-volatile goods in the pre-New Year market. Candles were generally found in two main qualities. The highest quality and most expensive were beeswax candles carefully made from honeycomb. These candles gave a clean white light, emitted a pleasant smell, and burned for a long time. Only churches, nobles, and very rich merchants could afford this luxury. You see the beeswax candles burning slowly and calmly. Their light was much more reliable and profound than the flickering light of ordinary candles. The more common and cheaper ones were candles and lamp oils made from animal fats, usually tallow. These materials gave a darker, more flickering light and emitted a heavy, unpleasant smell. Lamp oils were usually sold in coarse earthenware vessels, requiring constant adjustment of the wick and supervision of its burning. You see the people, their faces blurred under the dim, yellowish light of these tallow candles. Price changes rose dramatically and heavily as the new year approached. With the deepening of winter, the need for lighting increased. Especially for New Year rites and celebrations, stocking up on candles and oil became mandatory. Merchants silently turned this high demand into an opportunity, slowly but steadily raising prices. This price increase brought an extra burden on the peasant and poor population. Lighting became a luxury. Considering the general conditions of the period, lack of lighting made work or rest impossible during the long, dark days of winter. Candles were not just a practical need but also a spiritual protection symbol against the fear of darkness and evil spirits. As you watch people haggling over prices in the marketplace, you see how much effort they expended to obtain a few hours of light. Differences in candle quality also silently showed social status. The clean, long light of beeswax candles illuminated the lord's splendid banquets, while the dim light of a tallow lamp barely illuminated the peasant's small hut. This lighting difference was a heavy visual and olfactory reflection of medieval social division. This silent buying and selling routine in the marketplace was a weary indicator of the constant and expensive struggle against darkness. The first dream. You are now entering the state of someone slowly awakening from sleep in the first hours of the new year, on one of the deepest and most silent nights of the medieval winter. As the weight of darkness and cold continues, your mind tries to heavily piece together the mysterious fragments of dreams you saw a short while ago. The first dream of the new year was not seen as an ordinary sleep product but as a silent, fragile prophecy of the coming 12 months. Therefore, interpreting these dreams required great solemnity and heavy effort. The interpretation of dreams was a complex and uncertain art. Medieval people perceived dreams as a means of communication from God or evil spirits. As the blurry images in your mind slowly take shape, you struggle to place them within a framework of deep spiritual meaning. A bright image you saw could indicate a bountiful harvest or the family's health. A dark or blurry scene could foretell disease, famine, or the feudal lord's anger. This anxiety was the deepest and most personal worry of the waking moment. The silent narration of dreams was very important on the first day of the new year. Speaking your dream aloud was strictly avoided. The belief was that if the prophecy in the dream was spoken loudly to the outside world, it would lose its power or be seized by evil spirits. Therefore, the dreamer had to silently hide their dream in the deepest corners of their mind and only whisper it to a trusted family member or spiritual guide. Even the act of whispering was heavy and simple. You slowly and with halting breaths whisper the unusual events you saw into the ear of a close one whose face has darkened with weariness. While telling, not forgetting any detail and choosing the words correctly was of vital importance because the careful selection of words was the only chance for the prophecy to be interpreted correctly. Considering the general conditions of the period, medieval people's lives were under constant uncertainty and danger. The lack of a means to obtain certain knowledge about the future deepened dependence on supernatural sources like dreams. This anxiety was an effort to find consolation in the face of heavy disasters like epidemics, famines, and wars that people could not control. The dream gave them a chance to be prepared. Special booklets or manuscripts for interpreting dreams also existed, especially among monasteries and educated nobles. These books heavily and detailedly listed the traditional meanings of symbols. For example, seeing a black bird signaled a nearby death or sorrow, while a clear water source heralded spiritual cleansing and a new beginning. You compare the symbols in your dream with this heavy symbolic structure in your mind. Dreams also determine the individual's spiritual journey throughout the new year. If the dream contained a warning message, the dreamer had to spend the first days of the new year fasting, praying extra, or repenting. This was an effort to stop or at least mitigate a possible disaster. The first moment the dreams were seen was that fragile time before the first light of morning appeared. Upon waking, the person had to immediately record their dream in their mind because it was believed the details of the dream would quickly be forgotten in the bustle of daily life. This silent effort of remembrance was the first task of the new year. The complex and mysterious images in your mind were a silent reflection of the deep belief, fear of the unknown, and desire to control the future in medieval people's lives. The effort to decipher the hidden meaning of the dream was a sacred task that could shape the entire year and the heavy, monotonous beginning of the new year. The silent transmission kept the dream sacred and inviolable, preserving its power. Every detail carried a sign. Every symbol had deep spiritual weight. The artisan's forced idleness. You are now in front of the locked door of a cold, dark medieval artisan's workshop. From outside, the normally echoing sounds of hammer blows, the rustle of cutting leather, or the heavy thuds of the loom are not heard. During New Year's week, artisans had a religious and guild-imposed obligation to completely cease work. This mandatory stillness, while ensuring spiritual harmony, also brought with it a deep anxiety about income loss. This obligation was not just a holiday but also a necessity to withdraw from worldly pursuits on these sacred days. Guilds seriously supervised the enforcement of this rule. At home, you feel the heaviness of the silence rising from your workshop. Blacksmiths, carpenters, tailors, and tanners could not go to their own work, forced to silently leave their half-finished jobs waiting. This forced rest relaxed the body but filled the mind with anxiety. Income loss anxiety was one of the most prominent aspects of the medieval artisan's New Year experience. You silently calculate your small savings slowly depleting. Each passing day without work subtracted a piece from the family's ability to feed itself throughout the winter. Trade speed had already slowed in the winter months. This forced stoppage further aggravated the economic burden. You close your eyes and imagine the unfinished orders hanging in the darkness of the workshop. Considering the general conditions of the period, although artisans were in a slightly better situation than the peasantry, their economic security was very fragile. While the guild's strict rules aimed to preserve quality and commercial order, this New Year ban showed the sharp conflict between religious reverence and material reality. While the church prioritized spiritual salvation, the artisan had to calculate practical survival. The prohibition of work affected the artisan not only economically but also in terms of professional identity. An artisan's value was measured by the products they created with their hands. Sitting silently and not producing during this heavy process felt almost like a counter-purpose action. As you walk around the house, you miss the hard textures and weights your hands are accustomed to. This forced void drove some artisans to secretly breach the ban. There were those who tried to finish small jobs with very silent, heavy movements under a dim candlelight behind closed doors. This secret work, combined with the pressure of the fear of being caught, caused weariness to deepen further. For example, a tailor would use his needle in the softest fabric in a way that produced minimal sound. To alleviate income loss, the weeks before the New Year ban were spent with more intense and uninterrupted work. You remember staying by the fire for long hours in the days just before the New Year ban began, trying to finish every piece at top speed. This prior exhaustion made rest during the New Year week more a state of physical exhaustion than a necessity. When the ban ended, artisans immediately returned to their workshops, having to work even faster and heavier to make up for lost time. This constant cycle of intense work, forced stoppage, and renewed overwork reflected the deep economic stress in the medieval artisan's life. The silent anxiety experienced throughout New Year was a heavy reality, invisible from the outside but gnawing from within. As you feel the cold metal of the locked door, you silently calculate the material cost of this forced silence. Papal restrictions, early 1000s. You are now standing at a time in the early 1000s AD when Europe was entering a deep spiritual transformation. New Year traditions still contained elements of abundance and revelry from pre-Christian ancient traditions. These uncontrolled entertainments were a great concern in the eyes of the Church. The papacy, to establish the absolute authority of the Christian faith and reign in worldly excesses, began to impose heavy, restrictive regulations on New Year celebrations. These regulations were silent but definite orders emanating from very high up from Rome. The Church defined the New Year period as a sacred time that should be spent away from joy and waste, more in repentance, fasting, and reverence. On New Year's Eve, you deeply fear avoiding singing loudly or overindulging in drink according to old habits, because these behaviors were now seen not only as social deviance but also as a religious sin. One of the most important restrictions was the absolute ban on primitive rituals like masked balls or disguise. These traditions were labeled by the Church as pagan in origin and behaviors open to diabolical influences. On New Year's Day, as you go out from your house, you cannot see those strange costumes and noisy processions you used to see. Their place has been taken by people with serious faces walking to church with heavy steps. Considering the general conditions of the period, the papacy's aim was to extend the Church's authority to every area of social life. The control of an important period like New Year was an indicator of the church's not only spiritual but also social and political power. These restrictions placed the people's spontaneous desire for entertainment and togetherness under heavy discipline. Every moment of joy in your life now had to pass through the church's filter. Excessive food and drink consumption was also restricted. The days-long drinking binges and gluttony seen in previous centuries were strongly condemned in religious sermons. New Year feasts passed more calmly, limited, and reticent even for the wealthy classes. Instead of loud laughter and worldly songs, speaking in low voices and praying at the table were encouraged. While imposing these restrictions, the papacy applied continuous spiritual pressure through regional bishops and priests instead of using direct military force. Every sermon heavily and monotonously reminded of the divine penalties for not celebrating the new year correctly. These constant warnings in your mind caused you to silently question your own spiritual state instead of having fun. The restrictive regulations also determined how the first day of the new year would be spent. Working was banned except in forced cases. However, this free time had to be devoted entirely to religious activities instead of being filled with entertainment. You spend the first hours of the new year kneeling in long, exhausting rites. These papal interventions were a turning point in medieval society. The new year was no longer a period of escape where old pagan and folk traditions were freely lived but a heavy, serious religious turning point under the discipline of the Church. The weight of these restrictions upon you silently reminded of the spiritual obligations of the entire year. Every silent moment was slow proof of how deep and uninterrupted the Church's control was. The first Christmas trees. You are now witnessing a moment in the deep medieval winter when New Year traditions are just beginning to take shape. The concept of today's splendid and lit New Year tree existed in these early periods in a much simpler, heavier, and limited form. The fact that green trees remained alive even in the middle of winter was seen as a sacred symbol of life and fertility. The most primitive application of this tradition was limited to gently bringing a small pine branch, or usually pine cones, into the house. You see a small dark green pine branch placed in a simple vase in a corner of the house or leaned against the wall. The presence of this branch was a silent consolation source reminding of nature's resistance against the hardships of winter. Decoration was far from today's complex forms. The most commonly used ornament was the pine cones, the tree's own natural product. You feel the hard, heavy textures of the cones. These were sometimes lightly bleached or simply tied with red ribbons. These cones were not just decorations but also represented the seed of the new year and the hope of the next spring. Considering the general conditions of the period, medieval houses were small and interior spaces limited. Using a large tree taking up space was not practical. Also, the Church's suspicion of pagan traditions did not encourage splendid and overly decorated trees. This simple pine branch silently met the people's need for ancient nature rituals without angering the Church's authority. Usage was usually limited to the dimmest and least conspicuous corner of the home's main living area. Placing candles on the tree was almost never practiced in that era due to fire risk. Instead, an oil lamp or candle was heavily placed near the tree, its light only partially illuminating the branches' greenery. Even gathering the cones was a special ritual. You walk into deep forests in the winter cold. You search for and find intact, heavy cones that have fallen to the ground, one by one. This search was not just a material procurement, but also an act of silently accepting nature's gift. Every cone represented the potential fertility of the next year. Sometimes a small amount of honey or heavy sugary syrup found at home was spread on the cones. This was not only to make them shine but also carried the meaning of a small sweet offering presented to gods and good spirits. These heavy, sticky materials were slowly spread on the cones, creating a simple visual appeal. This early New Year tree tradition reflected the fragility and deep respect for nature in medieval people's lives. Dominated by simplicity instead of splendor, necessity instead of waste, this ritual allowed a silent, peaceful, and heartfelt entry into the new year. As you look at that small pine branch, you feel you are standing before a heavy symbol carrying a great hope. The weight of the cones reminded of the length of winter and the difficulty of survival. Heat distribution in a great hall. You are now in the center of a great, high-ceilinged hall of a noble lord. While the winter cold outside presses harshly, a heavy fire burns in the massive fireplace covering one wall from end to end. This fire was the hall's only heat source, and heat distribution was heavy and inefficient due to medieval architecture. The immediate surroundings of the fireplace were the only area illuminated by the fire's red glow, and perhaps offering a slightly comforting warmth. You see the silent struggle of the nobles and servants sitting here to be closest to the fire. Everyone was silently aware that being at the closest point to the heat source was an indicator of status. Heat distribution created an intense contrast. When you moved 2 meters away from the fire, the weight of the air suddenly changed. Temperature rapidly dropped. The hall's high ceilings and thick stone walls effectively absorbed and dispersed heat. A large mass of heat, being lighter, rose and gathered at the ceiling, leaving the great space below cold and dim. The corners of the hall were areas of absolute silence and deep cold. You walk towards a distant corner. As your steps echo lightly on the heavy stone floor, you feel the air become damp and icy. In these corners, silence dominated throughout the winter. Furniture was rarely used, shadows deepened, and the air gained an almost stagnant heaviness. Considering the general conditions of the period, the lack of an efficient heating system in medieval castles showed that warmth was a luxury. The silence in these cold corners was not just a physical condition but also a social demarcation. Servants or lower status individuals usually had to wait in these cold, silent areas. Their silence reflected and was a heavy show of respect for the Lord's dominance in the area of warmth and display. While conversations in front of the fireplace could be lively and loud, even silent whispers were unheard in the distant corners. Silence naturally occurred because sound was lost in the high ceiling. This spatial distinction showed that social hierarchy remained sharp even during New Year celebrations. As the night progressed, the sound of heavy logs added to the fireplace became the only regular noise breaking this silence. When the people by the fireplace fell asleep, the red embers of the fire spread a flickering, weary shadow over the cold, silent corners. Leaning against that cold wall, you feel that even in a place of great power and abundance, hardship and cold were inevitable. This space was a silent contrast showing the heaviness and discomfort of medieval life. Written greetings. You are now sitting at a rough wooden table in a medieval village before the new year. In this period when communication was very slow and laborious, New Year's week was a routine when long, tedious written greeting letters were sent between villages. These letters were more a requirement of social and economic protocol than emotional closeness. Writing the letters was a very heavy and time-consuming task. Due to limited literacy, most peasants had to get help from the village priest or eldest member to write these greetings. This process of getting help meant long waits and slow writing speed. You watched the letters being written in black ink on thick, coarse parchment under the flickering light of a candle. The content of the letters strictly adhered to traditional formulas. The content consisted not of personal feelings but of heavy, formal expressions about the religious meaning of the new year, long titles about the sender's respectability, and wishes for the new year to be fertile. These repetitive and ornate phrases made the letter boring and monotonous. The length of the letters reflected the sender's status. A longer letter meant greater respect and importance. During writing, you feel your neck aching and your attention wandering. But you had to make sure every word was written correctly. Making a mistake could be interpreted as disrespect to the recipient. Considering the general conditions of the period, sending letters was an expensive and unreliable task. Letters were carried heavily and slowly by special couriers or reliable travelers. Winter conditions further prolonged and risked this sending process. These long journeys increased the physical weight of the message. The delivery of the letter was also a formal routine. The recipient accepted the letter with a heavy ceremony, and its reading turned into another tedious routine. The letter was usually read aloud before the community, meaning everyone had to listen to the long, monotonous greetings. This reading was a kind of reaffirmation of social statuses. Although the content of the letters seemed boring from the outside, for medieval people it was a great source of assurance. It silently showed that these relationships were solid, the social order was unbroken, and commercial ties were preserved. You know that this heavy, long text sent before the new year was a fragile symbol of social stability. Every word represented a tradition. Every seal heavily confirmed the official beginning of a new year. The New Year's cleaning. You are now in the midst of one of the most difficult and heavy routines of medieval housewives, the comprehensive cleaning effort on New Year's Eve. This cleaning, aimed at casting off the dirt and misfortune of the old year, was incredibly arduous, especially due to the difficulty of moving furniture. Medieval furniture were not simple, light pieces. Massive, heavy oak chests, large dining tables, and high-backed hard chairs stood heavily on stone or earthen floors. You try to move a large chest from its place with your small hands. This challenging task was almost impossible alone and required the heavy, simultaneous effort of several people. The purpose of moving furniture was not only to clean visible dirt but also to purify the corners and underspaces believed to be hiding places for evil spirits and misfortune. The dense dust, soot, and crumbs accumulating under each furniture piece represented the heaviness of the old year. You try to heavily clean these thick, sticky dirts with a long broom. Considering the general conditions of the period, hygiene standards in medieval homes were very low. Therefore, New Year cleaning was not only symbolic but also vital to reduce mold and sources of disease accumulated throughout the winter. This heavy cleaning routine was a physical and spiritual weight placed on housewives' shoulders. The heavy creaks and friction sounds made while moving furniture became the only noise breaking the silent New Year preparations inside the home. These sounds were a monotonous symphony of labor and necessity. After furniture was moved, the floor was sometimes scrubbed heavily and slowly with sharp-smelling liquids like vinegar water. The moment the liquid spread on the cold stone floor, a sense of purification spread in the air. After cleaning finished, the furniture had to be placed back in their old spots or sometimes according to a new arrangement thought to bring luck. This replacement process progressed as heavily and slowly as the first. You feel your hands aching and your back stiffening with weariness. But with the awareness that every corner of the house must enter the new year clean and purified, you silently endure this hardship. This heavy routine was a weary example showing the physical difficulties of medieval home life and the spiritual importance of cleanliness. The old wine. You are now in the cold, damp, dark wine cellar under a noble mansion. On New Year's Eve, this place is not just a storage, but also like a sacred area displaying the Lord's wealth and long-term planning ability. As a special tradition at the New Year's feast, old wines brought up from the deepest corners of the cellar, with a very heavy taste, were served. The process of bringing out the wines progressed heavily and clumsily. Large, dusty, thick glass bottles were slowly taken from the shelves. The thick cobwebs and mold marks on them were carefully cleaned. These old wines seemed to carry the cellar's stable cold and silent air of years. You feel the heaviness of these bottles. You know they are not just a drink but also a piece of time. The taste of the wine served was far from the elegant flavors you know today. Medieval wines were usually unfiltered, had high alcohol content, and a very intense taste. Their long stay in the cellar gave them a heavy, earthy, and to some almost sour taste. You inhaled the intense, dominant smell of the dark red liquid poured into your glass. The serving of these heavy wines was a status display. Old wines silently emphasized the depth of the Lord's family history and the sustainability of his wealth. The older the wine and the more difficult its taste was to bear, the more valuable it was considered. Guests had to sip this wine with great respect and heavy ceremony, no matter its taste. Considering the general conditions of the period, wine was a vital drink in the Middle Ages when water was unreliable. But this New Year's wine was very different from daily consumption. It was a symbol of history and prestige. As you drink this heavy wine, you notice the intense, lasting taste left on your tongue. It reminded that the new year did not come only with sweet hopes, but also carried the heavy burden of the past. During serving, long, boring conversations were made about the wine. The Lord would describe in detail the year the wine was made, the quality of the vineyard, and how the bottle was stored in the cellar. This narration was a routine as important as the consumption of the wine. As you listen to these long monologues, you feel the heavy taste of the wine and the smell of cold cellars slowly numbing your mind. The serving of these old wines was a weary, monotonous custom showing the heavy attachment of medieval nobility to tradition, showiness, and status. The guards watch. You are now standing next to a soldier standing guard on the wall of a noble castle on one of the coldest and longest nights of winter. While the lords and guests downstairs pass the New Year's feast with heavy, formal ceremony, your duty is silent, monotonous, and incredibly tedious. New Year watches were one of the heaviest physical and mental trials in the guards' lives. The length and uninterrupted nature of the watch was the fundamental source of boredom. You watched the dark, snowy landscape through the thick stone battlements. Although the probability of an enemy appearing was very low, your attention could not be allowed to wander even for the slightest moment. This mandatory alertness was a constant struggle against the body's natural need for sleep. Cold increased the boredom further. The wind on the wall was sharp and freezing. Your thick wool clothes and heavy armor could only block this cold to a certain limit. You slowly notice your feet and toes beginning to go numb. The only thing providing warmth was periodically walking with heavy steps, which further reinforced the monotony. Sleep patterns were completely disrupted due to these heavy watches. Soldiers had to rely on short, interrupted, poor-quality sleep periods even during daytime hours. The weariness in your mind was a reflection of constant sleeplessness rather than a warrior's toughness. This irregular sleep increased the risk of error and repetitive duty. But for castle commanders, ensuring security was the primary priority. Considering the general conditions of the period, military life in the Middle Ages mostly consisted of long boredom and short periods of violence. On special periods like New Year, the weight of the watch silently showed that the lord's entertainments inside were made possible by the sacrifice outside. For you, the arrival of the new year meant not a feast but only the heavy change of a watch shift. Even secret efforts to relieve boredom were heavy and slow. Sometimes two guards would whisper stories to each other. But these conversations were so low they could only slightly suppress the howl of the wind. Watching time pass was a heavy task with no progress in the darkness. You feel the weight of each hour individually by watching the slow movement of stars in the sky. The end of the watch did not bring sudden relief. With weary muscles and shivering body, you returned with heavy steps to the cold, dim sleeping area of the barracks. Sleep did not come immediately. The cold and mental tension brought by the watch prevented sleep from deepening. Your rest was interrupted and remained superficial. This monotonous, heavy watch routine shows how laborious and requiring constant sacrifice the medieval security structure was. The soldier's entry into the new year was sealed with duty and endless boredom instead of joy. This weight upon you was the price of silently maintaining order in the castle. Every passing second heavily counted down the time remaining until the next shift. Folk dances. You are now standing around the folk dances, beginning with the arrival of the new year in the dim, snowy environment of a medieval village square. Although these dances were one of the greatest entertainments for the people, they contained a deep monotony due to their hours-long repetitions and simple rhythms. The rhythm of the dances was heavy, slow, and predetermined. The people formed a large circle, clasping each other's hands heavily. Music was usually limited to the repeating, not high tones of a bagpipe or a simple drum. You hear these sounds creating long, monotonous echoes in the winter air. Melodies were simple tunes that repeated themselves rather than changing. Dance movements were far from complex, energetic figures. They consisted of repeating simple steps like moving forward slowly and heavily within the circle, bending slightly at certain intervals, and then straightening again. These repetitions were not just for entertainment, but also to silently reinforce the community's harmony and order. Sustaining the same rhythm and movements for hours created physical exhaustion. You feel your feet aching from the cold and constant repetition. But leaving the circle was seen as a social deviance. Participation in these dances was a silent indicator of loyalty to the new year and conformity to the community. Considering the general conditions of the period, entertainment sources for the medieval peasant were very limited. These dances were the only real form of social entertainment of the year. However, due to the Church's strict rules, excessive joy or uncontrolled behavior was banned. Therefore, entertainment had to be kept calm and monotonous in accordance with religious authority. The monotony of the dances slowly directed the mind towards sleep and deep thoughts. Under the repeating rhythm, you forget the worries of daily life for a moment. But with the repetition of the rhythm, the obligation to stay awake returns. This was a constant balance of expression and control. Folk dances also carried a seasonal meaning. The circular dance represented the endless cycle of the sun and time everywhere. These heavy, repeating movements were a calm acceptance of nature's cycle and the beginning of a new season. The long, monotonous continuation of New Year dances reflected the heavy, rhythmic nature of medieval social days. Joy was short and temporary, but order and harmony were constant and mandatory. You continued to turn in the weight of this repeating rhythm in that cold square, welcoming the long, monotonous days of the new year.